The gleaming interior of a first-class cabin became an unexpected battleground of prejudice and redemption that day, as a high-powered executive's attempt to remove a female soldier from her rightful seat led to a moment that would forever change his understanding of service, sacrifice, and true worth. The encounter that unfolded aboard Flight 2317 would shake both their worlds in ways neither could have anticipated. The polished marble floors of LaGuardia Airport's Terminal B reflected Michael Barrett's perfectly shined Italian leather shoes as he strode purposefully toward the first-class lounge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 45, he carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to power and privilege. His tailored charcoal suit, expertly trimmed salt and pepper hair, and platinum frequent flyer card all served as carefully curated symbols of his success. As Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions at Sterling Financial, Michael had long ago mastered the art of calculating worth, of companies, of deals, and of people. His world was one of clear hierarchies and precise valuations, where everything and everyone could be assigned a specific dollar amount. This mindset had served him well, propelling him from a middle-class background in Nebraska to the upper echelons of New York's financial elite. The first-class lounge welcomed him with its familiar embrace of exclusivity. Michael settled into his usual corner chair, pulling out his MacBook Pro to review the details of his upcoming presentation in San Francisco. The Morrison deal was worth north of $800 million, and he had spent months orchestrating every detail. This meeting would be the culmination of his efforts, potentially the crown jewel in an already impressive portfolio. "Would you like your usual, Mr. Barrett?" The lounge attendant appeared at his elbow, already holding a glass of 18-year-old single malt scotch. Michael nodded absently, his attention fixed on the projection figures on his screen. He had long ago stopped learning the names of service staff. They were interchangeable parts in the machinery of his carefully ordered world. Around him, the lounge hummed with the quiet conversations of other elite travelers. Michael took pride in belonging to this exclusive circle, in having earned his place among those who understood the value of premium experiences. He had worked hard to distance himself from his modest beginnings, cultivating the refined tastes and discriminating standards that he believed his position demanded. His phone buzzed with a message from his executive assistant, confirming that his car service would be waiting at SFO, and that his suite at the Ritz-Carlton had been upgraded. Everything was arranged precisely as he preferred it, controlled, predictable, befitting his status. Michael allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction as he took a sip of his scotch. The announcement for priority boarding of Flight 2317 to San Francisco drew his attention. Michael gathered his belongings with practiced efficiency, straightening his Hermes tie as he stood. He had long ago memorized the optimal timing for boarding, late enough to avoid the unnecessary mingling with other passengers, early enough to ensure his carry-on found space in the overhead compartment above his seat. As he approached the gate, Michael mentally rehearsed key points from his presentation. The Morrison deal would be his legacy, the achievement that would cement his position in the upper ranks of Sterling Financial. He had sacrificed countless weekends and personal relationships to reach this point, and he refused to let anything compromise his carefully laid plans. The gate agent's greeting barely registered as she scanned his boarding pass. Michael's thoughts were already in San Francisco, anticipating the boardroom dynamics, calculating the precise moments to present his most compelling argument. His path to success had always been paved with meticulous preparation and an unwavering focus on his goals. Walking down the jet bridge, Michael allowed himself to feel a moment of pride. From the modest ranch house in Omaha, where he grew up, to the penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park he now called home, every step of his journey had been earned through determination and an unflinching commitment to excellence. He had long ago learned that in his world, respect was commanded through power, position, and the careful cultivation of an image that demanded deference. Little did Michael Barrett know that as he approached the first-class cabin of Flight 2317, he was about to encounter someone whose very presence would challenge everything he thought he knew about worth, respect, and true excellence. His carefully constructed world of status and hierarchy was about to collide with a different kind of power, one earned not in boardrooms, but on battlefields. The next few hours would test not just his prejudices, but the very foundations of how he measured human value. The first ripple of disruption in Michael's carefully ordered world came as he entered the first-class cabin of Flight 2317. His gaze immediately locked onto Seat 2A, his assigned position of privilege for this transcontinental journey. But something was wrong. Someone was already occupying his seat, and that someone defied everything he associated with first-class travel. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat straight-backed in 2A, her military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though she wore simple jeans and a black t-shirt, there was an undeniable air of quiet authority about her. A weathered army backpack rested at her feet, a stark contrast to the designer luggage favored by the cabin's usual occupants. Michael felt his jaw tighten as he double-checked his boarding pass. The numbers matched. Seat 2A, Flight 2317. His eyes narrowed as he observed the woman who dared to disturb his routine. She appeared to be in her early 30s, and despite her obvious military connection, he couldn't fathom how she had ended up in first class. "Excuse me." Michael's voice carried the practiced tone of someone used to having their wishes immediately granted. "I believe you're in my seat." He held out his boarding pass, like a trump card, expecting immediate compliance. Sarah turned to face him, her movements measured and deliberate. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of command. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. This is my assigned seat." She produced her own boarding pass with efficient precision. Michael's nostrils flared slightly as he examined both documents. The seat numbers were identical. This was exactly the kind of disruption he didn't need today, not with the Morrison deal hanging in the balance. He glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers were beginning to take interest in the developing situation. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice taking on an edge of condescension. "I always book 2A. I'm a platinum member, and this seat is specifically reserved for elite status passengers." The implied message was clear. He belonged here, she did not. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a hint of having faced such prejudgments before. "I understand your concern, sir," she responded evenly, "but I was upgraded to first class by the airline." She didn't elaborate further, didn't feel the need to justify her presence. Michael's frustration mounted. He gestured impatiently for a flight attendant, his perfectly manicured hand cutting through the air with sharp authority. "We need to sort this out immediately," he announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This seat is clearly meant for premium customers." The flight attendant, Jessica, approached with professional composure. Before she could speak, Michael launched into his complaint, his words clipped and precise. "There's been an obvious error in seat assignment. I'm sure we can find a more appropriate placement for this passenger." Sarah remained seated, her posture unchanged, but her eyes tracked the interaction with the same alertness that had kept her alive during 3 tours of duty. She said nothing, letting the situation unfold, her silence carrying more weight than any words could convey. Jessica reviewed both boarding passes, her experienced gaze taking in the situation. "Both passes are valid for Seat 2A, she confirmed, then turned to her tablet to investigate further. The tapping of her fingers on the screen seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere. Michael's impatience grew with each passing second. Time was slipping away, and with it, his carefully planned pre-flight routine. "This is unacceptable," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of countless corporate battles won. "Surely there's another seat available for—" He paused, gesturing dismissively at Sarah's casual attire. "Other passengers." The phrase hung in the air, its implications clear to everyone within earshot. A few other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but no one intervened. The invisible barriers of first-class etiquette held firm, even as the situation teetered on the edge of open confrontation. Sarah finally spoke, her voice level, but carrying an unmistakable note of steel. "Sir, if there's been a duplicate booking, I'm happy to work with the airline to resolve it. But I won't be moved simply because you've decided I don't belong here." The challenge in her words was subtle, but clear. Michael felt his face flush slightly. Unused to such direct opposition, he opened his mouth to respond, but Jessica interrupted with practiced diplomacy. "If you'll both give me just a moment, I'll check with the gate agent about this situation." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As Jessica stepped away, Michael remained standing in the aisle, his presence a looming reminder of his refusal to accept the situation. He pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the screen as he composed a scathing email to his travel agent. This disruption would have consequences, he would make sure of that. Little did he know that his carefully constructed world of privilege and entitlement was about to be shaken to its very foundations. The true nature of his seat companion, and the lessons she would teach him about worth, service, and sacrifice were about to unfold in ways he could never have anticipated. The tension in the first-class cabin continued to build as Jessica returned, her tablet displaying information that made her expression shift subtly. She glanced between Michael and Sarah, clearly weighing her next words carefully. The other passengers had given up any pretense of not watching the unfolding drama, their attention fixed on the standoff between the executive and the soldier. "Mr. Barrett," Jessica began diplomatically, "I've confirmed with the gate agent that there has been a duplicate seat assignment. However," she paused, choosing her words with precision, "Captain Mitchell's upgrade was authorized directly by airline management as part of our military service recognition program." Michael's jaw clenched visibly. The idea that some military appreciation program could override his platinum status was incomprehensible to him. His fingers drummed against his leather briefcase as he processed this information, each tap a physical manifestation of his growing irritation. "Sure, there's another first-class seat available," he pressed, his voice taking on the same tone he used to close difficult negotiations. "I have an important business meeting in San Francisco, and I specifically chose this seat for its convenience during takeoff and landing." Sarah remained seated, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Michael's barely contained agitation. She had faced far more threatening situations than an entitled businessman's disapproval. Her hands rested easily in her lap, but her posture retained the alertness that had become second nature during her years of service. Jessica consulted her tablet again. "There is one other first-class seat available, 4C, in the last row." She gestured toward the back of the first-class cabin, where the seat in question was clearly less desirable than the prime position of 2A. "Unacceptable," Michael snapped, his patience wearing thin. "I've held platinum status with this airline for 8 years. Surely that counts for something more than a random upgrade program." His emphasis on the word random carried clear disdain. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, the first visible crack in her composed facade. "There's nothing random about military service, Mr. Barrett," she said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "Though I wouldn't expect someone like you to understand that." The subtle rebuke hit its mark. Michael felt heat rise in his neck as other passengers murmured in response to Sarah's words. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, especially in an environment he considered his natural domain. "I understand plenty," he retorted, his voice sharp. "I understand that I paid full price for this specific seat while you're here on some courtesy upgrade. In the real world, you get what you pay for." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Even Jessica seemed taken aback by the baldness of his statement. Sarah slowly stood up, and despite being several inches shorter than Michael, her presence somehow seemed to fill more space than his. "In the real world, Mr. Barrett," she replied, each word precise and measured, "sometimes you pay with something other than money." Her hand unconsciously touched her right side, where under her civilian clothes, a long scar marked where shrapnel had torn through her during a rescue mission in Kandahar. The standoff continued, neither willing to back down. Other passengers were now openly watching, their own first-class comfort forgotten in the face of this clash of worlds. A distinguished older gentleman in 1B shook his head disapprovingly at Michael's behavior, while a young woman in 3A seemed to be discreetly recording the interaction on her phone. Jessica attempted to defuse the situation once more. "Mr. Barrett, I apologize for the inconvenience, but I must ask you to either take seat 4C or wait while we explore other options. We need to complete boarding." Michael's face flushed darker. The thought of retreating to an inferior seat, of effectively losing this very public confrontation, was almost physically painful to him. His entire professional life had been built on never backing down, on always maintaining the upper hand. "This is ridiculous," he declared, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "I want to speak to your supervisor. I want to know exactly who authorized this arrangement." His gesture toward Sarah managed to convey both dismissal and disdain. Sarah remained standing, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice carrying the same tone she had used to command troops in crisis situations, "you're delaying the flight for everyone. Take the other seat or don't. But this discussion is over." The finality in her voice, the unmistakable command presence she projected even in civilian clothes, seemed to momentarily stun Michael. He opened his mouth to argue further, but for perhaps the first time in years found himself without a ready response. What happened next would shake Michael's carefully constructed worldview to its core, though he didn't know it yet. The truth about Captain Sarah Mitchell, and the price she had paid for her place in that seat, was about to emerge in a way that would leave him fundamentally changed. The tense standoff was interrupted by an unexpected voice from across the aisle. "Captain Mitchell?" The question came from an elderly man in seat 2B who had been quietly observing the confrontation. His eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Sarah Mitchell from the 10th Mountain Division?" Sarah turned slightly, maintaining awareness of Michael while addressing the older man. "Yes, sir," she responded, her professional demeanor softening slightly. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" The man's face broke into a warm smile as he struggled to stand, leaning heavily on a cane. "No, but I'd know your face anywhere. I was at the ceremony, Pentagon, last spring." His voice carried a mixture of awe and respect that made several other passengers lean forward with interest. Michael watched this exchange with growing irritation, sensing that the situation was slipping further from his control. He opened his mouth to interject, but the older man continued speaking, his voice gaining strength and purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the cabin at large, "we are in the presence of a genuine hero." He turned to Michael, his elderly features hardening slightly. "And you, sir, are making a complete fool of yourself." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her natural modesty warring with the need to maintain her ground in the ongoing seat dispute. "Sir, that's really not necessary," she began, but the man pressed on. "Captain Mitchell here," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "led a rescue mission under heavy fire to save 3 wounded soldiers and 2 civilian aid workers. She took shrapnel in the process, but refused evacuation until every member of her team was safe." The cabin had gone completely silent. Even the general shuffle of boarding an economy class seemed to have paused. Michael felt the weight of disapproving stares from every direction, but he stood his ground, clinging to his last shreds of indignation. "That's all very admirable," he said stiffly, "but it doesn't change the fact that—" "She was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross." The elderly man cut him off sharply. "Do you know what that means, Mr. Barrett? It's the second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism. Only a handful of women have received it since World War II. Sarah's face remained composed, but a slight flush had crept into her cheeks. This was exactly the kind of attention she typically avoided, preferring to let her actions speak for themselves. But something in the older man's fierce defense touched her deeply. Jessica, the flight attendant, had stopped pretending to check her tablet and was staring at Sarah with undisguised admiration. Other passengers were whispering among themselves, several pulling out phones to search for news articles about the decorated captain. "I was just doing my job," Sarah said quietly, but firmly, the same as any soldier would have done in that situation. Her hand unconsciously moved to her side again, where the shrapnel scars served as a permanent reminder of that harrowing day. Michael felt his world tilting slightly off its axis. The woman he had been trying to dismiss, whose right to occupy space in his privileged domain he had so confidently questioned, suddenly appeared in a new light. His carefully constructed hierarchy of worth, based on wealth and status, seemed to crack slightly at its foundation. A young businesswoman in 3A spoke up, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "My brother serves in the Army. People like you, Captain Mitchell. You're the reason he comes home safe." Several other passengers nodded in agreement. The elderly man wasn't finished. She not only saved those lives that day, but she's continued to serve by working with wounded veterans, helping them adjust to civilian life. And here you are, Mr. Barrett, throwing a tantrum over an airline seat. Michael's face had progressed from red to an almost alarming shade of purple. The magnitude of his misjudgment was becoming painfully clear, playing out in front of an audience of his peers, other first-class passengers who would normally have been his natural allies in any dispute over privilege and status. Jessica cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Barrett, I really must insist that you take your seat now. We need to complete boarding." Her tone had lost any trace of apology, carrying instead a clear note of authority backed by the collective will of the cabin. Michael stood, frozen, for a moment longer, his world of absolute certainties crumbling around him. The distinction between earned privilege and true merit had never been so starkly illustrated. In his thousands of first-class flights, he had never felt less entitled to his position of comfort. He began, then stopped, for once in his life at a complete loss for words. But this moment of humbling revelation was just the beginning. What would unfold during the 6-hour flight to San Francisco would challenge everything Michael Barrett thought he knew about value, service, and the true meaning of worth. The next few minutes unfolded in a blur of subdued activity, as Michael finally retreated to seat 4C, his movement stiff with barely contained emotion. As he stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment, his hands trembled slightly, not with anger now, but with something less familiar: shame. The weight of his public humiliation pressed down on him like a physical force. From his new position at the back of first class, Michael had a clear view of Captain Mitchell's profile. She had resumed her seat with quiet dignity, engaging in soft conversation with the elderly man who had spoken up in her defense. Their interaction carried none of the artificial politeness that characterized most first-class cabin small talk. There was something genuine there, something that made Michael feel even more like an outsider. As the remaining passengers filed past to reach their seats in economy, several paused briefly to smile or nod respectfully at Sarah. A young soldier in uniform, heading to the back of the plane, actually stopped to render a crisp salute, which Sarah returned with practiced precision. Each such interaction felt like another small indictment of Michael's behavior. Jessica, the flight attendant, moved through the cabin with pre-flight drinks. When she reached Michael, her previously warm professional demeanor had cooled to barely civil efficiency. "Water, sir?" she asked, not bothering to recite the usual premium beverage options. Michael accepted the plastic cup without meeting her eyes, acutely aware that he had lost more than just his preferred seat. His phone buzzed with an email about the Morrison deal, but for the first time in years, Michael found himself unable to focus on business matters. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to the scene he had caused, replaying his words with growing discomfort. "In the real world, you get what you pay for," he had said. The phrase now echoed in his mind with devastating irony. Through the gap between seats, he could see Sarah pull out a worn paperback, not the latest business bestseller or luxury magazine, but what appeared to be a medical text on trauma recovery. She read with intense concentration, making occasional notes in the margins. Michael found himself wondering about the stories behind those notes, about the experiences that had led a decorated military officer to study such material. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane began its taxi to the runway. In the subdued lighting, Michael noticed something he had missed earlier, a slight stiffness in Sarah's movements as she adjusted her position. The elderly man's words came back to him. She took shrapnel in the process but refused evacuation until every member of her team was safe. Michael touched his own side reflexively, trying to imagine the kind of courage such an action required. Around him, the familiar sounds of takeoff preparation continued. The flight attendant's safety demonstration, the rumble of engines, the captain's announcements. But everything felt slightly surreal, as if Michael was experiencing it all from outside himself. His usual pre-flight routine of reviewing presentations and making last-minute calls lay forgotten. As the plane accelerated down the runway, Michael caught fragments of conversation from nearby passengers, all discussing Sarah's story. Some were searching her name on their phones, sharing details of her service record in hushed, admiring tones. Others were still shooting disapproving glances in his direction. A woman across the aisle was typing furiously on her phone, and Michael had the sinking feeling that his behavior would soon be trending on social media. The aircraft lifted off, banking slightly as it turned toward San Francisco. Michael watched as Sarah gazed out her window, her expression thoughtful. What was she seeing out there? What memories played behind those alert eyes? His own reflection in the window across the aisle showed a man he hardly recognized, disheveled, uncertain, stripped of his usual confident facade. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Jessica began preparing the cabin for beverage service. Sarah pulled out a small pill bottle, swallowing something quickly with a sip of water. The motion was discreet, practiced, but Michael noticed her hand press briefly against her side again. Physical reminders of service and sacrifice carried quietly beneath civilian clothes. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, Michael realized that his carefully structured world had shifted fundamentally in the space of less than an hour. The metrics he had used to measure human worth, wealth, status, power, suddenly seemed shallow and inadequate. Here was someone who had literally put her life on the line for others, who carried the physical and psychological scars of that service, yet asked for no special recognition. The Morrison deal, which had consumed his thoughts just moments ago, now felt trivial in comparison. What were hostile takeovers and corporate mergers measured against actual matters of life and death? What was his platinum status worth compared to the price others paid in blood and pain for their country? As the beverage service began, Michael found himself dreading the long flight ahead. For the first time in years, he was forced to sit with his thoughts, to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his values. Yet something else was stirring beneath his discomfort, a growing desire to understand, to learn, to somehow make amends for his behavior. Little did he know that the opportunity for redemption was about to present itself in an unexpected way. The first hour of the flight passed in uncomfortable silence, with Michael barely touching the lunch service placed before him. His attention kept drifting to the interactions at the front of the cabin, where Sarah continued her quiet conversation with the elderly veteran. Their easy camaraderie made his isolation feel even more acute. The carefully arranged salmon on his plate grew cold as he pushed it around absently, his appetite diminished by the weight of his earlier behavior. Then, somewhere over Nebraska, the smooth journey hit unexpected turbulence. The plane dropped suddenly, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to gasp. Michael gripped his armrests, but his attention was drawn to a sharp intake of breath from the front of the cabin. Through the gap between seats, he saw Sarah's face contort briefly in pain, her hand pressing hard against her side. The sudden vulnerability in her expression was a stark contrast to her earlier composed demeanor. The elderly man beside her leaned over in concern. "Are you all right, Captain?" His voice carried clearly in the tense cabin. Sarah nodded, but her face had gone pale, and Michael could see beads of sweat forming on her forehead. The overhead lights caught the moisture on her skin, highlighting the strain evident in her features. "Just the old wounds acting up," she said quietly, though the strain in her voice was evident. "Sometimes changes in pressure can—" She trailed off as another wave of turbulence hit, her jaw clenching visibly. Her fingers dug into the leather armrest, knuckles whitening with each new jolt of the aircraft. Jessica hurried forward, professional concern written across her features. "Captain Mitchell, is there anything you need?" "We have a medical kit?" She positioned herself protectively beside Sarah's seat, casting a quick glance around the cabin as if daring anyone to question this break-in-service routine. Sarah shook her head. "My medication is in my bag in the overhead compartment," she managed, attempting to rise but sinking back as the plane shuddered again. "I just need to." Her voice caught as another wave of turbulence rocked the aircraft, the pain clearly intensifying with each atmospheric pressure change. Without conscious thought, Michael found himself standing, despite the illuminated seatbelt sign. He moved quickly to the front of the cabin, reaching overhead to retrieve Sarah's weathered army backpack. The scuffs and worn patches on the bag spoke of years of service, each mark telling its own story of sacrifice and duty. The elderly veteran watched him with surprised interest as he handed the bag to Sarah. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight but controlled. As she unzipped a side pocket, Michael noticed her hands trembling slightly. Instead of returning to his seat, he remained standing, feeling strangely compelled to help but unsure how. The business executive who had so confidently demanded his preferred seat earlier now seemed uncertain, stripped of his usual assurance. Sarah found her medication and swallowed it with a sip of water, her movements precise despite her obvious discomfort. The turbulence continued to rock the aircraft, and Michael noticed her grip on the armrest whitening with each jolt. Her breathing had become measured and deliberate, a practiced response to managing pain that spoke of long experience. "The pressure changes," the elderly veteran explained quietly to Michael. "They can aggravate shrapnel wounds, even years later. The body remembers." His eyes held a knowing look that suggested personal experience with such matters. Each piece of metal leaves its own memory, its own story written in scar tissue and nerve endings. Michael found himself sinking into the empty aisle seat across from Sarah, his previous concerns about status and seating arrangements forgotten. "Is there anything I can do to help?" he asked, surprising himself with the genuine concern in his voice. The words felt foreign on his tongue, unused to offering assistance rather than demanding it. Sarah managed a small smile, though pain still lined her features. "It'll pass. Always does." She took a deep breath, then added, "Though distraction usually helps. Tell me about this important meeting in San Francisco." Despite her discomfort, she seemed genuinely interested, her training in focusing beyond physical distress evident in her attempt to engage. The invitation caught Michael off guard. After his earlier behavior, he had expected only cold dismissal. Yet here she was, offering him a chance at conversation, at redemption perhaps, even while dealing with her own pain. The generosity of the gesture made his earlier actions seem even more shameful. "It's a corporate merger," he began hesitantly, then stopped. "Actually, it seems rather insignificant now compared to—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing Sarah's current situation and everything he'd learned about her service. The Morrison deal, which had consumed his thoughts just hours ago, suddenly felt trivial in the face of real courage and sacrifice. "No," Sarah said firmly, though her voice remained strained. "Every job has its importance, its challenges." Another wave of turbulence hit, and she grimaced. "Keep talking, tell me about it." Her military training was evident in her ability to focus outward, to push past her own discomfort to engage with others. So Michael did. He found himself explaining the Morrison deal, but not in the usual terms of profits and market share. Instead, he talked about the people involved, the employees whose jobs he was trying to save, the communities that would be affected by the merger. As he spoke, he realized he was seeing his own work through new eyes, understanding its impact on real lives rather than just bottom lines. As he spoke, he noticed Sarah's grip on the armrest gradually relaxing, her color slowly returning to normal. The elderly veteran contributed occasional questions, showing a surprising grasp of business mechanics. The conversation flowed more naturally than any Michael could remember having in first class, free from the usual pretenses and posturing that characterized business travel. The turbulence eventually subsided, but the discussion continued. Michael found himself engaged in a dialogue that challenged his perspectives on value and success in ways he had never considered. With each passing minute, his earlier behavior seemed more incomprehensible to him. Yet this moment of connection, this unexpected bridge between their different worlds, was about to lead to an even more profound revelation, one that would force Michael to confront not just his prejudices, but his entire understanding of courage and sacrifice. The real test of his transformation was still to come, and it would demand more of him than he could possibly imagine. As their conversation deepened, Sarah shifted in her seat, the movement causing a slight wince that she quickly masked. The elderly veteran, who had introduced himself as Frank Thompson, noticed her discomfort and reached for her water bottle, but Sarah waved him off with a practiced smile, her military bearing reasserting itself as the medication began to take effect. "Tell me more about these employees," she said to Michael, genuine interest evident in her voice. "The ones affected by your merger. How many families are we talking about?" Her question caught Michael off guard. In all his months of planning the Morrison deal, he had never thought about it in such personal terms. "There are 847 employees across 3 facilities," he replied, the numbers coming automatically. Then, after a pause, he added, I suppose that means at least 847 families." The realization seemed to settle heavily on his shoulders. Sarah nodded, her eyes holding his with unexpected understanding. "In the military," she said, adjusting her position carefully, "we never just count soldiers. We count families, support networks, entire communities. Every decision we make ripples outward." Her words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned at great cost. Frank leaned forward, his elderly features animated with interest. "Sounds similar to when I was in Vietnam. Every tactical decision affected not just our units, but the local villages, the civilian population." He turned to Michael. "In business, you must see similar ripple effects?" Michael found himself considering the Morrison deal from this new perspective. Beyond the spreadsheets and profit projections, beyond the boardroom presentations and stock valuations, there were real people whose lives would be fundamentally altered by his decisions. "We've been focusing on maximizing shareholder value," he admitted, the corporate jargon suddenly sounding hollow. "The plan was to consolidate operations, streamline redundant positions." He trailed off, seeing these euphemisms for what they were, sanitized terms for decisions that would disrupt hundreds of lives. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but her eyes held a challenging gleam. "In my experience," she said carefully, "the best leaders find ways to accomplish the mission while minimizing casualties. Sometimes that means getting creative with strategy." A flight attendant approached with fresh drinks, and Michael noticed how her manner had thawed considerably towards him since he'd helped Sarah. The small gesture of humanity had shifted something in the cabin's dynamics. As she served their drinks, she shared a respectful smile with Sarah. "The thing about leadership," Sarah continued once the attendant had moved on, "is that it's not just about achieving objectives, it's about how you achieve them." She paused, considering her next words. "Sometimes the harder path is the right one." Michael found himself thinking about alternative approaches to the Morrison merger. Could there be a way to achieve the necessary business outcomes while preserving more jobs? The challenge intrigued him in a way that pure profit maximization never had. "During my last tour," Sarah said, her voice taking on a distant quality, "we had to evacuate a village under enemy fire. The easy solution would have been to focus on the able-bodied, leave the elderly and injured behind. Better numbers, faster execution." Her hand unconsciously touched her side again. "But that wasn't an option we could live with." The parallel to his business situation wasn't lost on Michael. He had been planning to sacrifice the weaker divisions for the sake of efficiency, much like abandoning those who couldn't keep up. The comparison made him deeply uncomfortable. Frank nodded sagely. "Sometimes the true measure of leadership is finding a way to protect everyone under your command, even when it complicates the mission." His aged eyes held decades of wisdom. even when it costs you personally. The conversation was interrupted by another bout of turbulence, milder this time. Sarah tensed briefly, but maintained her composure, though Michael noticed a fresh sheen of sweat on her forehead. Without thinking, he offered her his unused napkin. "Thank you," she said softly, the simple exchange carrying more weight than the words themselves. "You know, Mr. Barrett, when you first approached my seat, I thought I had you figured out. But people can surprise you." Michael felt a mix of shame and hope at her words. "I had myself figured out too," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm not sure that person was someone I'm proud to have been." The plane cruised onward through clear skies, but the atmosphere in their corner of first class had transformed. The rigid barriers of status and privilege had melted away, replaced by something more genuine. Yet as Michael was about to discover, this transformation was far from complete. The next revelation about Sarah's service would shake him to his core, forcing him to confront an even deeper truth about valor, sacrifice, and the real meaning of worth. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Jessica, the flight attendant, returned with a fresh round of drinks. She hesitated for a moment, then addressed Sarah with barely contained admiration. "Captain Mitchell, I hope you don't mind, but I looked you up during my break. You're the one they call the guardian angel of Kandahar, aren't you?" Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of something complex crossing her features before she composed herself. Michael watched as she took a measured breath before responding, noting how her military bearing seemed to intensify. "That's just a nickname the media came up with," she replied quietly, but Jessica wasn't deterred. Other passengers had begun to lean in, their interest piqued by this new development. Frank's eyes held a knowing look, suggesting he'd been aware of this detail all along. "But it's true, isn't it?" Jessica pressed gently. "The rescue mission where you saved those children from the collapsed school? The news articles said you went back into the building 3 times despite being wounded." Her voice carried a mix of awe and respect that made Sarah visibly uncomfortable. Michael found himself leaning forward, his previous concerns about the Morrison deal momentarily forgotten. He watched as Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to her side again, where he now knew the shrapnel wounds lay hidden. "We were just doing our job," Sarah said firmly, but Frank interjected with gentle authority. "Sometimes the job requires extraordinary courage, Captain. There's no shame in that being recognized." The elderly veteran turned to Michael and the other listening passengers. "What the articles don't mention is that the school collapse wasn't an accident. It was a targeted attack designed to create maximum civilian casualties. Captain Mitchell's unit was the first to respond." Sarah's eyes had taken on a distant look, as if seeing beyond the confined space of the aircraft to that dusty day in Kandahar. "The first blast was just the beginning," she said softly, almost to herself. "We knew there were likely secondary devices, but we could hear the children crying inside." The cabin had grown completely silent, the usual ambient noise of flight seeming to fade away. Even the most disinterested passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. Michael found himself holding his breath, the gravity of the moment palpable. "The building was extremely unstable," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a detached, professional tone that seemed to help her maintain composure. "Standard protocol would have been to wait for the combat engineers, but we calculated that would take at least 40 minutes. The children didn't have that long." Jessica had sunk into an empty seat, her service duties temporarily forgotten. Michael noticed that her hands were trembling slightly as she listened. Frank reached over and patted Sarah's arm encouragingly, urging her to continue. "We formed a chain," Sarah explained, her eyes focused on some distant point. "Each time we brought out a child, we passed them down the line to the medics. The dust was so thick you could barely see, and the remaining support beams were groaning." She paused, swallowing hard. "After the second trip, we heard another section starting to give way." Michael found himself gripping his armrest, fully engrossed in the story. The merger documents in his briefcase, which had seemed so crucial just hours ago, now felt trivial in comparison to the weight of what he was hearing. The third time, Frank added quietly. She went in despite having taken shrapnel from a secondary explosion, saved 3 more children before the building finally came down completely. His voice carried both pride and a deep understanding of what such choices cost. Sarah shook her head slightly. Anyone would have done the same, she insisted, but the cabin's reaction suggested otherwise. Michael could see tears in Jessica's eyes, and several other passengers were visibly moved. 27 children, Frank stated, his voice firm. That's how many lives you saved that day, Captain. Plus the 4 members of your team who you got out before accepting medical attention for yourself. The numbers hung in the air, each one representing a life that might have been lost if not for Sarah's courage. Michael sat in stunned silence, processing what he'd heard. The woman he had tried to displace from her seat, whose right to occupy space in first class he had so arrogantly questioned, had willingly entered a collapsing building multiple times to save children she'd never met. The contrast between her actions and his own recent behavior was stark and humbling. But as he was about to discover, this story was just the beginning. The full extent of Sarah Mitchell's service and the true cost of her courage would soon be revealed in a way that would permanently alter Michael's understanding of value, sacrifice, and human worth. There's something the articles don't mention about that day, Frank said quietly, his eyes meeting Sarah's with understanding. The cabin remained hushed, the usual sounds of flight seeming distant as passengers leaned in to listen. Something about why they really called you the guardian angel. Sarah's expression shifted, a shadow crossing her features. Mr. Thompson, I don't think, she began, but Frank continued with gentle insistence, his elderly voice carrying surprising authority. They need to understand, Captain, especially now. He glanced meaningfully at Michael before continuing. The last child she went back for. Tell them about her, Sarah. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, her military composure wavering slightly. When she spoke, her voice was softer than before. Her name was Amira. She was 7 years old. We could hear her crying from beneath the rubble, but the building was. She paused, collecting herself. The structural engineers on scene gave it less than 5 minutes before total collapse. Michael watched as Sarah's hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles whitening with the memory. Jessica had long abandoned any pretense of service duties, standing motionless in the aisle, completely absorbed in the story. My team had already pulled out, Sarah continued. Protocol demanded it. The risk was too high. But this little girl, she kept calling out in English, "Please don't leave me." Sarah's voice caught slightly. She'd learned it at the school we were supposed to be protecting. The implications of those words, the failure to protect, the weight of responsibility, hung heavy in the air. Michael found himself leaning forward, his own breathing shallow as he listened. I ordered my team to stay back, Sarah said, her tone shifting to that of a commander. Made it clear it was my decision alone. The building was groaning, chunks of concrete falling everywhere, but I could still hear her voice getting weaker. Frank interjected softly. What the captain isn't telling you is that she'd already taken significant shrapnel wounds by this point. The medics were screaming for her to get treatment. Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her side again. The path to Amira was blocked. I had to squeeze through gaps in the rubble. Each movement sent shockwaves through the structure. But finally I reached her. She was trapped beneath a fallen beam but alive. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Even those passengers who had been pretending not to listen had given up all pretense, fully invested in the story. I couldn't lift the beam alone, Sarah continued, her voice distant with memory. And the building. We could hear it coming apart around us. So I did the only thing I could. I wedged myself into the space beside her, used my body as a shield. Michael heard several sharp intakes of breath. Jessica had tears streaming down her face now, not bothering to wipe them away. The collapse seemed to last forever, Sarah said quietly. I just kept talking to her, telling her to keep breathing, promising I wouldn't leave. When it was over, we were in a tiny pocket of space. The rescue team took 4 hours to reach us. 4 hours, Frank emphasized, his voice heavy with meaning. 4 hours of lying there with untreated wounds, keeping that child calm in complete darkness, not knowing if another collapse would come. Sarah straightened slightly, discomfort evident in her posture. Amira survived. That's what matters. She's in college now, studying to be a teacher. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. She sends me cards every year. But Frank wasn't finished. Tell them what happened when they finally got you out, Captain. Tell them about the infection, the surgeries, the months of rehabilitation. Mr. Thompson, Sarah said firmly, her tone carrying a note of warning. But Michael could see it now. The slight stiffness in her movements, the careful way she held herself. The cost of her courage was written in her every motion. The guardian angel of Kandahar, Frank said, addressing the cabin at large. Not just because she saved those children, but because she was willing to lay down her life to protect even one of them. That's the kind of person you tried to remove from this seat, Mr. Barrett. Michael felt the weight of every eye in the cabin turned to him. The shame of his earlier behavior, already significant, now seemed overwhelming. But in that moment, something else was building inside him. A profound realization about the true meaning of worth and status that would soon lead to an unexpected decision. The revelation of Sarah's complete story was about to trigger a chain of events that would transform not just Michael's perspective, but the lives of everyone involved in ways none of them could anticipate. The silence that followed Frank's words was broken by a soft chime, the captain announcing their initial descent into San Francisco. Sarah used the interruption to excuse herself, making her way carefully to the lavatory. Michael watched her go, noting how several passengers reached out to touch her arm as she passed, offering silent gestures of respect and gratitude. The woman in 3A dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while a businessman who had been engrossed in his laptop throughout the flight finally closed it, seeming lost in thought. "She'll hate that I told that story," Frank said quietly, once Sarah was out of earshot. She never wanted recognition for what she did, turned down 3 interviews with major networks, even declined a book deal. He turned to face Michael directly. The Medal of Honor Committee considered her actions that day, did you know that? One of the few times they've considered a female soldier. Michael shook his head, still struggling to process everything he'd learned. His world of corporate achievements and financial victories seemed increasingly hollow. Why didn't they award it? He asked, genuinely curious. The elderly veteran's expression grew complicated, his weathered face telling its own story of service and sacrifice. Sarah withdrew herself from consideration, he explained, adjusting his position carefully. Insisted that the focus should be on the 2 members of her unit who didn't make it out of other missions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and Lieutenant Chen. She makes sure their names are never forgotten. That's the kind of leader she is. Frank's aged eyes held decades of military experience. Some heroes don't want medals. They just want to make a difference. Jessica approached with fresh water for everyone, her professional demeanor softened by obvious emotion. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the glasses on their tray tables. "We're starting our descent soon," she said, then hesitated before adding, "Mr. Barrett, I've spoken with the purser. We'd like to upgrade Captain Mitchell to first class for her return flight next week. Would you consider using some of your platinum miles to make that happen?" The request caught Michael off guard, but it sparked something in him, an opportunity for tangible action rather than just regret. Before he could respond, Sarah returned to her seat. He noticed how she moved with careful precision, the earlier turbulence and lengthy conversation having clearly taken a toll. Yet her bearing remained proud, her presence commanding respect without demanding it. "The weather's clearing up," she commented, deflecting attention from herself as she settled back into her seat. "Should be a smooth landing." The practiced change of subject spoke volumes about her character, always directing focus away from her own sacrifices. Through the window, the late afternoon sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and purple. Michael found himself reaching for his briefcase, pulling out the folder containing his Morrison deal documents. The numbers and projections that had consumed his thoughts now seemed to blur before his eyes, transforming into faces, employees, families, communities. Each spreadsheet cell represented a real person with hopes, dreams, and responsibilities. "Captain Mitchell?" he said, suddenly surprising himself with the formality in his voice. "Would you be willing to look at something?" He held out the merger proposal, its heavy paper and corporate letterhead suddenly seeming inadequate, almost embarrassingly superficial in the face of real courage and sacrifice. Sarah accepted the document with military precision, her eyes beginning to scan the executive summary. Frank leaned in with interest, his business acumen evident in his focused attention. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as they descended through a layer of clouds, the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. 847 employees, Sarah murmured, recalling their earlier conversation. Her fingers traced the staffing numbers carefully, as if each digit represented a real person. In a way, Michael realized, they did. Each number was a family, a mortgage, a child's college fund, a retirement dream. "The board wants streamlined operations," Michael explained, feeling strangely vulnerable beneath her analytical gaze. "Maximum efficiency, minimum redundancy. But after everything I've heard today..." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm wondering if there's a better way. A way that doesn't treat people as just numbers on a balance sheet." Sarah looked up from the document, her gaze sharp and analytical. "In the military," she said thoughtfully, "we sometimes find that perceived redundancy is actually essential resilience. Every soldier needs a backup. Every position needs coverage." Her tactical training was evident in how quickly she grasped the organizational structure. Sometimes what looks like excess capacity on paper is actually your survival margin in the real world. "The problem is the cost projections," Michael admitted, pointing to the relevant figures. "The shareholders won't accept anything less than a 15% return on investment. The pressure to cut costs is intense." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, the corporate jargon failing to mask the human impact of such decisions. Frank adjusted his glasses, peering at the numbers. "In Vietnam," he offered, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "we learned that sometimes the most expensive option up front saves resources in the long run. It's about strategic thinking, not just tactical gains. You have to look beyond the immediate numbers to see the true cost of your decisions." The plane began its descent into San Francisco, the sunset painting the cabin in warm hues. As the city lights began to appear below, Michael felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental change in how he viewed success, value, and leadership. The Morrison deal, which had seemed so straightforward that morning, now appeared in a different light, filled with moral complexities and human considerations he'd never bothered to see before. What he didn't know yet was that this conversation would lead to a complete reimagining of the Morrison deal, one that would challenge corporate conventions and transform lives in ways he never expected. The real test of his transformation was about to begin, and it would require every bit of the courage he'd witnessed in Sarah's story. The plane descended through layers of clouds, its wings tilting as it approached San Francisco International Airport. Sarah continued studying the Morrison documents, her tactical mind clearly processing the information in ways Michael had never considered. Her fingers traced the organizational charts with the same precision she must have once used to analyze military operations. "You know what this reminds me of?" she said, tapping a particular section of the restructuring plan. "We had a similar situation in Afghanistan with our medical evacuation protocols. Everyone wanted to streamline operations, reduce redundancy. Made perfect sense on paper." She paused, her expression growing distant. "Until the day we had multiple simultaneous casualties in different locations." Frank nodded knowingly, while Michael leaned forward, intrigued by the parallel. "What happened?" he asked, the merger documents momentarily forgotten in his genuine curiosity about her experience. Those redundant resources they wanted to eliminate, they saved lives that day. Sarah's voice carried the weight of command experience. Every backup helicopter, every extra medic we'd insisted on keeping, they all proved essential. Sometimes what looks like inefficiency from a distance is actually your margin of survival. Michael felt something click in his mind as he considered the Morrison deal through this new lens. "So you're saying these overlapping positions we're planning to eliminate," he began, seeing the parallels forming. "They're your organizational resilience," Sarah finished. "Look here." She pointed to a department slated for significant cuts. "These support staff you're planning to consolidate? They're like our backup communication systems. Seems redundant until your primary system fails." The cabin lights flickered briefly as the plane encountered mild turbulence. Sarah adjusted her position carefully, her earlier discomfort still evident, but overshadowed by her engagement with the problem at hand. Frank watched the exchange with quiet approval, occasionally offering insights from his own military and business experience. "But the shareholders," Michael protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "The market expects certain margins, certain efficiencies." Even as he spoke the words, they felt increasingly hollow. Sarah fixed him with a steady gaze. "In the military, we have a saying, mission first, people always. The mission matters. In your case, profitability, market share, shareholder value. But how you achieve that mission, how you treat your people in the process, that defines you as a leader." Jessica appeared to remind them to prepare for landing, but lingered to listen to the conversation. Other nearby passengers had also turned their attention to the impromptu strategy session unfolding in their midst. "Tell them about Operation Safeguard," Frank suggested to Sarah, his eyes twinkling with knowing appreciation. "About how you reorganize the supply lines." Sarah shook her head modestly, but Frank persisted. "It's relevant," he insisted. "Mr. Barrett needs to hear this." Taking a deep breath, Sarah began reluctantly. "We had a situation where standard protocol called for centralizing all supply operations through one main base. Theoretically more efficient, better control. But I saw how it left our forward units vulnerable." Michael listened intently as she continued. "Against considerable opposition, I restructured our supply network, created smaller, seemingly redundant distribution points. Costs went up initially, logistics got more complicated. My superiors weren't happy." "But then the Taliban launched their spring offensive," Frank interjected, clearly familiar with the story. "And suddenly those inefficient backup supply lines became critical. We didn't lose a single unit to supply shortages," Sarah confirmed quietly. "The extra cost paid for itself many times over in lives saved and objectives achieved." The plane's landing gear deployed with a heavy thunk, but Michael barely noticed. His mind was racing with new possibilities for the Morrison deal. The principles Sarah described, resilience over efficiency, people over immediate profits, challenged everything he'd learned in business school, yet rang undeniably true. "It's not just about the numbers," he said slowly, understanding dawning. "It's about building something that can survive unexpected challenges, that takes care of its people even when things get tough." Sarah nodded approvingly. "In combat, we learn quickly that the cheapest solution isn't always the best solution. Sometimes, you have to invest more upfront to prevent catastrophic failures later." As the plane touched down on the runway, Michael found himself pulling out his phone, opening his email to the board of directors. The carefully crafted presentation he'd planned to deliver tomorrow would need significant revisions. He had a new vision to propose, one that prioritized resilience over short-term gains. What he didn't realize yet was that this transformation in his thinking would lead to consequences far beyond the Morrison deal. His encounter with Sarah Mitchell was about to reshape not just one corporate merger, but an entire approach to business leadership. The real challenge lay ahead, convincing hardened executives to see what a wounded warrior had helped him understand about true value and sustainable success. As the plane taxied to the gate, the cabin stirred with the usual post-landing activity. Passengers reached for phones, gathered belongings, and prepared for their swift exits. But in the first-class cabin, The atmosphere remained charged with something deeper. Michael sat quietly, his merger documents spread across his tray table, marked now with notes from his conversation with Sarah, observations that would fundamentally change his approach to tomorrow's presentation. "The board meeting is at 9 tomorrow morning," he said, almost to himself. Then, gathering his courage, he turned to Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, I know this is unorthodox, but would you consider joining me for that meeting? Your perspective could be invaluable in helping them understand this new approach." Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. Frank leaned forward with interest, his weathered face creasing in an approving smile. Around them, other passengers paused in their preparations to listen, invested now in this unexpected story of transformation playing out in their midst. "Mr. Barrett," Sarah began carefully, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure the board of Sterling Financial would be interested in military perspectives on corporate restructuring." Her hand unconsciously moved to her side again, a gesture Michael now recognized as a reminder of the price she'd paid for her leadership lessons. "They need to hear this," Michael insisted, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "They need to understand what you've helped me see, about resilience, about true leadership, about valuing people over short-term profits." His words carried through the quiet cabin, drawing nods from several listeners. Jessica, who had been hovering nearby, stepped forward. "Captain Mitchell, if timing is a concern, I can help arrange for a later flight back to New York. The airline would be honored to accommodate you." The offer carried the weight of the entire crew's respect for Sarah's service and sacrifice. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, her military training evident in how she analyzed the situation. "It's not just about sharing military strategies," she said finally. "These 847 families, they deserve more than being reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. They deserve leaders who understand the human cost of their decisions." Frank reached over and patted her arm. "Sometimes, Sarah, the best way to serve is to help others understand what you've learned. Those lessons from Kandahar, from your years of command, they're valuable beyond the battlefield." The plane came to a stop at the gate, but no one in their section moved to leave. The usual rush to exit had been suspended, as if everyone sensed the importance of this moment. Michael watched Sarah's face, seeing the same determination there that must have driven her back into that collapsing building in Afghanistan. "The meeting is at the Sterling Financial offices downtown San Francisco," Michael said, pulling out his business card. "I'll have a car waiting at your hotel at 8:30. He paused, then added softly, "Please, help me do this right." Sarah accepted the card with military precision, studying it for a moment before tucking it away. 847 families, she repeated quietly. "I'll be there. But Mr. Barrett," her eyes met his with steel-like intensity, "if I do this, we do it my way. No compromises when it comes to people's lives." Michael nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of this commitment. Around them, passengers had begun to stand, gathering their belongings, but the usual post-flight chaos seemed muted, respectful of the moment unfolding in their midst. "I'll have my team send over more detailed documents tonight," Michael said, gathering his papers. "And Captain Mitchell. Thank you. Not just for this, but for helping me see what real leadership looks like." As they prepared to disembark, Jessica approached one final time. "Captain Mitchell, your return flight has been upgraded to first class." She glanced at Michael with approval. "And the crew would be honored if you'd join us for dinner tonight. We'd love to hear more about your service." Sarah began to demur, but Frank interrupted gently. "Accept the gratitude, Captain. You've earned it." His eyes twinkled with wisdom. "And perhaps these new friends need to hear your stories as much as you need to tell them." As passengers finally began to file off the plane, Michael watched Sarah gather her weathered backpack, noting how she moved with careful precision. Tomorrow, this decorated soldier would help him challenge corporate conventions and fight for 847 families. The board of Sterling Financial had no idea what was coming, but first they would share a meal with the crew, listening to stories of courage and sacrifice that would put corporate battles into perspective. The real test of Michael's transformation lay ahead, but he was no longer facing it alone. He had found an unexpected ally in the very person he'd tried to displace, and together, they would redefine what it meant to lead with purpose. What none of them yet realized was that this unlikely partnership would catalyze changes far beyond one corporate merger, touching lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The journey that had begun with a seat dispute was about to reshape the landscape of business leadership itself. The executive boardroom of Sterling Financial's San Francisco office gleamed with polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the bay. At precisely 8:55 a.m., Michael stood at the entrance, his heart racing with an unfamiliar mix of anxiety and determination. Beside him, Sarah Mitchell cut a striking figure in her formal military dress uniform, medals and commendations catching the morning light. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked quietly, adjusting her sleeve with practiced precision. She had arrived at the office exactly as promised, her appearance transforming the moment she stepped out of the car. Gone was the casual traveler from yesterday's flight. In her place stood a decorated officer whose very presence commanded respect. "More sure than I've ever been about anything," Michael replied, surprising himself with his conviction. Through the glass walls, he could see board members filing in, their expressions curious about the unexpected presence of a uniformed officer. Chairman Davidson, a steel-haired veteran of countless corporate battles, was already seated at the head of the table, frowning at his tablet. "Remember," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of command, "we stick to the plan. No compromises." Her hand brushed unconsciously against her side, where Michael knew the scars of her sacrifice lay hidden beneath her uniform. The dinner with the flight crew the previous night had stretched late into the evening, with Sarah sharing stories that had left everyone profoundly moved. More importantly, it had given them time to develop a strategy for today's presentation, one that would challenge every conventional corporate wisdom about efficiency and value. As they entered the boardroom, Michael noted how the usual pre-meeting chatter died away. 15 pairs of eyes fixed on Sarah, taking in her decorations, the obvious authority she carried. Chairman Davidson's frown deepened, but Michael detected a flicker of something else in the older man's expression, recognition, perhaps, of the weight those medals represented. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Before we discuss the Morrison deal, I'd like to introduce Captain Sarah Mitchell. She's here to help us understand something crucial about leadership and organizational structure." He paused, meeting each board member's gaze. "Something I learned just yesterday about the true cost of our decisions." Sarah stepped forward, her movements precise and measured. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying easily through the room. "I'm here to talk to you about resilience, about the real meaning of efficiency, and about 847 families whose lives hang in the balance of your decisions today." The board members stirred uneasily. This was not the presentation they had expected. Davidson leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Barrett," he began, "this is highly irregular. So is watching your team die because someone decided backup resources were inefficient," Sarah cut in, her words landing like artillery shells in the pristine corporate environment. "With respect, sir, I'd like to share a story about what happened in Kandahar when similar decisions about streamlining were made." For the next 20 minutes, Sarah held the room spellbound as she recounted not just the school collapse, but other missions where redundancy had meant the difference between life and death. She drew explicit parallels to the Morrison reorganization plan, challenging the board to see beyond mere numbers to the human costs of their decisions. Michael watched his colleagues' faces as Sarah spoke, noting the shifting expressions, the growing understanding. When she described lying in the darkness with a wounded child, protecting her with her own body as the building collapsed around them, several board members were visibly moved. "Leadership," Sarah concluded, her voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom, "isn't about making the easiest decisions or the cheapest ones. It's about making the right ones, even when they're hard, even when they cost more up front." The silence that followed her words was profound. Michael stepped forward, spreading the revised Morrison proposals across the table. "I've reworked the entire restructuring plan," he said. "Using principles Captain Mitchell helped me understand about organizational resilience and long-term sustainability." Chairman Davidson picked up the new proposal, his expression thoughtful. "These numbers," he said slowly, "they're different from what we discussed. The immediate return on investment is lower." "Yes," Michael acknowledged, standing straighter. "But the long-term stability is significantly higher. We're not just preserving jobs. We're building a more resilient organization, one that can weather future challenges without sacrificing its people." What happened next would reshape not just the Morrison deal, but the entire corporate culture of Sterling Financial. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the boardroom in golden light, a new understanding of value and leadership was about to emerge, one forged in the crucible of combat and brought home to transform the battlefield of business. Chairman Davidson studied the revised proposal with the intensity of a man who had built his career on analyzing risk and reward. The boardroom remained silent, save for the gentle hum of climate control and the soft rustling of papers as other board members reviewed the new numbers. Michael stood firm beside Sarah, both of them waiting with practiced patience, hers learned in combat, his in corporate warfare. "These projections," Davidson finally spoke, his voice measured, "suggest we maintain duplicate systems in several key departments." He looked up at Sarah. "Captain Mitchell, you've drawn parallels to military redundancy protocols. But this is business, not warfare." Sarah stepped forward, her metals catching the morning light. "With respect, sir, leadership principles remain constant whether you're protecting lives or livelihoods. When we eliminated backup communications in Kandahar to cut costs, we lost 3 good soldiers in a single afternoon. Their families paid the price of our efficiency." The words hung heavy in the air. A board member near the end of the table, Janet Chen, spoke up. "But our shareholders expect certain returns. These numbers," she gestured at the revised proposal, "they're well below industry standard for immediate ROI." "Ms. Chen," Michael interjected, his voice carrying a confidence he'd never felt before. "Yesterday I would have made the same argument, but Captain Mitchell helped me see something crucial: the hidden costs of pursuing short-term gains at the expense of organizational resilience." Sarah moved to the large screen at the front of the room, pulling up a diagram from the original Morrison proposal. "Look at your current structure," she said, highlighting several departments. "Every position you've marked for elimination represents not just a salary, but a family's stability, a community's strength, a child's future. This isn't about sentiment," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of command that had guided troops through combat. "It's about strategic thinking. When we lost those soldiers in Kandahar, we didn't just lose lives. We lost years of experience, institutional knowledge, trained capabilities that couldn't be replaced quickly." Michael advanced to the next slide, showing his revised organizational chart. "What we're proposing isn't just about saving jobs," he explained. "It's about building a stronger, more adaptable organization, one that can withstand market fluctuations, adapt to unexpected challenges, and maintain operational integrity even under stress." Davidson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The board has a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders," he reminded them, but his tone had shifted, becoming more contemplative than confrontational. "Sir," Sarah responded, "in the military, we learned that the most expensive option is often having to rebuild what you have destroyed through short-sighted decisions. When we eliminated our backup medical teams to cut costs, we ended up spending 3 times as much establishing new ones after we learned the hard way why we needed them." The room grew quiet as board members processed this perspective. Janet Chen was rapidly taking notes, while others were engaged in hushed discussions. Michael could sense the momentum shifting, the rigid corporate mindset beginning to crack under the weight of Sarah's battle-tested wisdom. "What about the competitive advantage?" another board member asked. "If we maintain these redundancies while our competitors streamline, Then we'll be the ones still standing when market conditions turn hostile, Michael finished firmly. Captain Mitchell taught me something crucial about true efficiency. It's not about running lean, it's about running smart. About having the resources to not just survive but adapt and grow stronger through challenges. Sarah touched her side unconsciously, where her combat scars lay hidden beneath her uniform. In Afghanistan, we learned that the units which survived and succeeded weren't the ones with the leanest operations. They were the ones with the depth and flexibility to adapt when circumstances changed. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the boardroom table. Davidson studied the revised proposals one more time, then looked up at Sarah with new respect in his eyes. "Captain Mitchell," he said slowly, "would you be willing to serve as a consultant on this restructuring? Your perspective." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It challenges our assumptions in ways we clearly need." The request caught both Sarah and Michael by surprise, but before either could respond, the chairman continued. "In fact, I believe all our major reorganization projects could benefit from this kind of strategic analysis. We've been so focused on efficiency metrics, we've lost sight of true organizational strength." Michael felt his heart race with unexpected hope. This was more than he dared imagine. Not just acceptance of the revised Morrison plan, but a fundamental shift in how Sterling Financial approached corporate restructuring. What none of them realized in that moment was that this meeting would become legendary in corporate circles, the day a wounded warrior taught Wall Street a lesson about true value and sustainable success. The transformation that had begun with a disputed airline seat was about to ripple through the entire business world. The months that followed the transformative board meeting saw changes that rippled far beyond the Morrison deal. Michael stood now at his office window watching the San Francisco sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and purple, reflecting on how much had shifted since that fateful flight. The framed newspaper article on his wall told part of the story. Sterling Financial revolutionizes corporate restructuring. Military wisdom meets Wall Street. Sarah's influence had extended far beyond her initial consultation. Under her guidance, Sterling Financial had developed what they called the Resilience Protocol, a new approach to corporate reorganization that prioritized organizational strength over mere efficiency. The Morrison deal had become a case study in business schools, showcasing how companies could maintain profitability while preserving their human capital. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Just landed in New York. Board presentation went exactly as expected. They're implementing the protocol across all divisions." Michael smiled, remembering how skeptical other financial institutions had been initially. Now they were lining up to learn from Sterling's example. The 847 families that had been slated for workforce reduction were not only still employed but thriving. The redundancies that old-school executives had criticized had proved their worth during the recent market volatility, allowing Sterling's divisions to adapt and even grow while competitors struggled with stripped-down operations. "Mr. Barrett?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The video conference with the Veterans Employment Initiative is ready to begin." Another of Sarah's influences, a program that helped veterans translate their military leadership experience into corporate roles. Michael straightened his tie and headed to the conference room. On the large screen, familiar faces appeared. Sarah was there, still in her uniform from the New York presentation. Beside her sat Frank Thompson, who had become a regular advisor to the program. But it was the other faces that made Michael pause. Former military leaders now bringing their battle-tested wisdom to corporate America. "Good evening, everyone," Sarah began, her command presence undiminished by the digital medium. "We've got some exciting updates on the Employment Transition Program." She proceeded to share statistics that validated everything they'd been working toward. Veteran employment rates up, corporate resilience metrics improving, a whole new paradigm of leadership taking root. Michael's mind drifted back to that first-class cabin, to his shameful attempt to displace Sarah from her seat. How differently things might have turned out if she hadn't been there, if Frank hadn't shared her story, if he hadn't been forced to confront his own prejudices and limitations. The quarterly reports on his desk told the financial side of the story. Sterling's new approach had initially shocked market analysts, who predicted doom for what they called military-style redundancy. But as other companies faced crises brought on by too lean operations, Sterling's resilient structure proved its worth. Share prices had climbed steadily, attracting investors who valued sustainable growth over quick returns. "Michael?" Sarah's voice brought him back to the present. "Would you like to share the impact numbers from the Morrison implementation?" He nodded, pulling up the data they'd gathered. The figures were impressive. Productivity up, turnover down, employee satisfaction scores at record highs. But it was the human stories behind the numbers that really mattered. After the video conference, Michael remained in his chair, reflecting on the journey. His office walls, once decorated with deal trophies and financial awards, now featured different accomplishments. A photograph of him with Sarah and Frank at the Veteran Employment Initiative launch. A letter from a Morrison employee whose job, and family's stability, had been preserved by the new protocols. A military command coin Sarah had given him, reminding him daily of the lessons learned about true leadership. His phone buzzed again. A message from Chairman Davidson. "Pentagon interested in our corporate resilience model. Want us to train their procurement division. Captain Mitchell's worlds colliding in the best way." Michael smiled at the irony. The military wisdom that had transformed their corporate approach was now flowing back to its source. The sun had set completely now, the city lights twinkling below his office window. On his desk sat a new proposal. Another company seeking Sterling's guidance in implementing the resilience protocol. The old Michael would have seen it as just another deal, another chance to prove his corporate prowess. But now, he saw it differently. As an opportunity to extend the lessons he'd learned at 30,000 feet when a wounded warrior taught him the true meaning of value. Tomorrow, he would board another flight to another city, but this time as a different kind of leader. The first-class cabin would no longer be a symbol of status, but a reminder of where his transformation began. And somewhere in that transformation, he had found something more valuable than corporate success. He had found purpose. What had started as a moment of shame had become a movement of change, touching lives far beyond that chance encounter on Flight 2317. The final chapter of this story was still being written in boardrooms and offices across the country, where the wisdom of a warrior was reshaping the very nature of corporate America. 1 year to the day after that fateful flight, Michael found himself back at LaGuardia Airport, this time waiting at the same first-class lounge where his journey of transformation had begun. The space looked identical, the same polished marble floors, the same attentive staff, the same air of exclusivity, but he was no longer the same man who had sat here a year ago, consumed by status and self-importance. Today, he waited for Sarah and Frank to arrive. They were scheduled to give the keynote address at Sterling Financial's annual leadership conference, where the resilience protocol would be officially established as the company's global standard for organizational management. But more than that, they were gathering to commemorate the anniversary of a chance encounter that had changed countless lives. As he sipped his coffee, no longer the expensive single malt that had once been his signature, Michael reviewed the impact report on his tablet. The numbers told an extraordinary story. Employee retention up 47%, operational efficiency increased by 32%, and most importantly, over 10,000 jobs preserved across various companies that had adopted their new approach to corporate restructuring. "Mr. Barrett?" A familiar voice caught his attention. It was Jessica, the flight attendant from Flight 2317. "I thought that was you." She smiled warmly, her uniform indicating she was about to start her shift. "I've been following Sterling's transformation in the news. What you and Captain Mitchell have accomplished. It's incredible." Before Michael could respond, he spotted Sarah and Frank entering the lounge. Sarah walked with the same military bearing, though her civilian clothes were more polished now, reflecting her new role as a corporate consultant. Frank moved slower than a year ago, but his eyes still sparkled with the same wisdom that had helped catalyze their unlikely partnership. Just like old times, Frank chuckled as they joined Michael. Though the circumstances are a bit different, wouldn't you say? He settled into a comfortable chair, glancing meaningfully at the spot where Michael had once sat reviewing merger documents with such single-minded focus. Sarah greeted Jessica with a warm hug. They had stayed in touch over the past year, with the flight attendant often sharing stories of how their example had influenced her own leadership style among her crew. "Ready for another life-changing flight?" Sarah asked Michael with a hint of amusement. "I think one was enough," Michael replied, smiling. "Though I'm thankful every day for that particular twist of fate." He pulled out a newspaper article he'd saved, showing it to the group. The headline read, "From Battlefield to Boardroom, How Military Wisdom is Reshaping Corporate America." The article detailed how Sterling's resilience protocol had sparked a movement across the business world. Companies were rethinking their approach to restructuring, prioritizing organizational strength over short-term gains. Veterans were being actively recruited for their leadership experience, bringing battle-tested wisdom to corporate challenges. "Did you ever imagine," Sarah asked, "that your attempt to kick me out of that seat would lead to all this?" There was no bitterness in her voice, only a gentle recognition of how far they'd all come. "I was so blind back then," Michael admitted, "focused on all the wrong measures of success." He paused, remembering his former self with a mix of embarrassment and gratitude for the lessons learned. "You both taught me what real leadership looks like." Frank leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The best lessons often come from unexpected teachers. Sometimes it takes a warrior to show a businessman the true meaning of value." As their flight was called for boarding, Michael noticed something different about himself. The familiar surge of entitled impatience was gone, replaced by a deeper appreciation for the journey itself and the companions who shared it. Today, he would board the plane not as a privileged executive, but as someone who had learned that true worth couldn't be measured in platinum status or corner offices. They walked together toward the gate, their conversation touching on plans for expanding their Veterans Employment Initiative and the next phase of Sterling's transformation. But more than the business discussions, they shared the comfortable silence of people who had witnessed something remarkable together, the reshaping of corporate values through the wisdom of military service. As they approached the first-class cabin, Michael paused, letting Sarah and Frank board first. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything he had learned about respect, humility, and true leadership. The cabin crew recognized them, word having spread about their story, and welcomed them with special warmth. Settling into their seats, Michael reflected on how a moment of conflict had transformed into a mission of change. The view from first class was the same as it had been a year ago, but his perspective had shifted fundamentally. What had begun as a disputed seat assignment had become a movement that was changing the very DNA of corporate America, one resilient organization at a time. The engines hummed to life as the plane prepared for takeoff, carrying not just 3 passengers, but the continued promise of transformation. Their story had become legend in both military and business circles, a testament to the power of unexpected wisdom and the courage to change. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, it carried with it the legacy of a journey that had begun with prejudice, but had blossomed into purpose. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.